The September sun beat down mercilessly on Oakwood Terrace, casting long shadows across meticulously manicured lawns that spoke volumes about the neighborhood's unspoken war of aesthetic perfection. Mark Thompson stood on his front porch, sweat beading on his forehead, clutching a half-empty coffee mug and staring in disbelief at the pristine white envelope that had just been dropped into his mailbox. He knew exactly who had sent it before he even opened the letter. Karen Reynolds, the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, lived 2 doors down, a woman whose passion for municipal codes and residential regulations burned brighter than her perfectly highlighted blonde hair. Mark had watched her for years, patrolling the street like a suburban sheriff, her manicured finger perpetually poised to point out the slightest infraction of her unwritten neighborhood constitution. With deliberate slowness, Mark walked down the porch steps and retrieved the envelope. The stationery was expensive. Thick, cream-colored paper with precise typewritten lines that screamed official communication. He could almost hear Karen's voice in his head as he broke the seal, precise, condescending, with that particular tone that suggested she was doing him a massive favor by bringing something to his attention. The letter was exactly what he expected. A formal complaint about his hedgerow, a magnificent row of Leland cypress trees that lined the property's boundary. According to Karen, the hedge had grown approximately 3.2 feet beyond the recommended municipal height restriction, and was creating a visual disturbance that significantly impacted neighborhood aesthetic standards. Mark couldn't help but chuckle. The hedge was his pride and joy, a living monument to his stubborn nature and love of botanical rebellion. When he first planted the cypress saplings 5 years ago, they were barely knee-high. Now they formed a robust green barrier that provided privacy, wind protection, and most importantly, a buffer between himself and neighbors like Karen. But this wasn't just about a hedge. This was about territory, about individual freedom versus community conformity. Mark had bought this house specifically to escape the suffocating rules of his previous suburban neighborhood, where homeowners associations tracked the length of grass blades and the exact shade of white allowed for exterior paint. He remembered the day he'd moved in. Karen had been the first to welcome him, armed with a bundt cake and a multi-page document outlining the community expectations for the street. Mark had listened politely, nodded in all the right places, and then promptly ignored every single suggestion. Now, 5 years later, their relationship had devolved into a cold war of passive-aggressive communications. Each letter from Karen was a calculated missile designed to provoke a response to make him conform. And each time, Mark had found increasingly creative ways to demonstrate his complete and utter disregard for her regulations. The hedge complaint was different, though. This felt personal. This felt like a declaration of war. Mark looked at the letter again, his fingers crumpling the expensive paper. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. Karen wanted a response. He'd give her a response she would never forget. Little did Karen know, Mark wasn't just going to respond to her complaint. He was about to turn their neighborhood dispute into a legendary statement of suburban defiance that would be whispered about for years to come. The hedge was about to become his canvas, and Karen was about to become his unwitting muse. The local garden center had never seen anyone approach hedge trimming with such military-like precision. Mark arrived early Saturday morning, his truck loaded with an arsenal of professional-grade landscaping equipment that would make most professional gardeners weep with envy. 3 different types of hedge trimmers, electric, gas-powered, and a custom-modified professional model, sat carefully arranged like soldiers awaiting deployment. Dave, the garden center's longtime manager, watched Mark with a mixture of curiosity and concern. They'd known each other for years, and he recognized that particular glint in Mark's eye, the same look he'd seen when Mark had rebuilt his vintage motorcycle or constructed an elaborate backyard fire pit that violated at least 7 different neighborhood ordinances. "You're planning something," Dave said, more a statement than a question. Mark just smiled. "Just doing some landscaping maintenance," he replied innocently, his fingers running along the razor-sharp blade of a professional topiary trimmer. The truth was far more elaborate. Mark had spent the entire week preparing for this moment. He'd studied architectural blueprints, calculated precise angles, and even consulted with a retired landscape architect friend who now lived in Florida. This wasn't going to be a simple hedge trimming. This was going to be a statement. His research had revealed that Leland cypress trees were particularly well-suited for topiary work. Their dense foliage and rapid growth made them the perfect medium for his artistic revenge. Most people saw a hedge. Mark saw a blank canvas waiting to be transformed. Back home, he spent hours setting up elaborate scaffolding around the hedge. Laser levels ensured mathematical precision. String lines were meticulously stretched, creating guidelines that would transform his botanical boundary into something extraordinary. Neighbors who passed by gave him curious looks, but Mark was lost in his vision. Sarah, his next-door neighbor and the only person on the street who found humor in his ongoing war with Karen, stopped by with a cold beer. "You know this is going to cause absolute chaos," she said, watching him measure and remeasure sections of the hedge. "That's entirely the point," Mark responded, a mischievous glint in his eye. What Karen didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Mark had been planning this moment for weeks. Every measurement, every calculation was designed to create something that would be visible from space, impossible to ignore and completely impossible to regulate. The first cuts would be crucial. Mark knew that topiary was part art, part engineering, and part pure audacity. He needs steady hands, perfect vision, and a complete disregard for conventional landscaping norms. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows across his yard, Mark made his first cut. The electric hedge trimmer hummed to life, its blade glinting like a promise of rebellion. The neighborhood would never be the same again. By day 3 of his hedge project, Mark had become a neighborhood spectacle. Neighbors peered out of their windows, smartphones at the ready, watching the elaborate transformation take shape. Scaffolding surrounded the massive cypress hedge like a skeletal exoskeleton, with Mark moving between levels with the precision of a surgeon and the determination of a man on a mission. Karen Reynolds made her first physical appearance on the third day, marching across the street with her tablet clutched like a weapon of bureaucratic destruction. Her perfectly pressed khaki capras and immaculate white blouse seemed to vibrate with righteous indignation. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she announced, standing at the edge of Mark's property line. "I've already filed 2 additional complaints with the municipal board. Whatever you're doing is certainly in violation of at least 17 separate neighborhood ordinances." Mark didn't even look up from his work. His hands moved methodically, electric trimmer buzzing with surgical precision. Piles of cypress branches lay around him like discarded battle plans, each cut more deliberate than the last. Sarah, watching from her front porch, couldn't suppress a laugh. She'd known Mark for years. They'd moved to the neighborhood around the same time, both seeking a kind of suburban freedom that seemed increasingly impossible to find. Where Karen saw rules, Mark saw restrictions to be challenged. The first hint of Mark's true intention began to take shape around midday. A local teenager named Jake, who often cut lawns in the neighborhood, stopped his mower and stared. "Mr. Thompson," he called out, "are you actually doing what I think you're doing?" Mark just winked. By late afternoon, whispers began to spread. The local Facebook community group, normally a battleground of passive-aggressive commentary about trash can placement and lost pets, erupted into a frenzy of speculation. Screenshots of the half-completed hedge began to circulate, with comments ranging from outrage to barely contained excitement. Mrs. Goldstein, the retired art teacher who lived across the street, was the first to truly understand what was happening. She'd spent years teaching topiary as an art form, understanding that landscaping could be more than just maintenance. It could be a statement, a form of personal expression. "It's brilliant," she muttered to herself, adjusting her glasses and watching Mark work. Karen continued to hover, her face growing redder by the minute. She called the municipal office 3 times already, each conversation becoming more heated. The city inspector was scheduled to arrive the next morning, a fact Mark knew all too well. As sunset approached, Mark stepped back from his creation. The rough outline was now visible, though most of the neighborhood couldn't quite comprehend what they were seeing. It was massive, detailed, and required a level of skill that went far beyond simple hedge trimming. Sarah walked over, a 6-pack of local craft beer in her hand. "You do realize this is going to be legendary, right?" Mark just smiled. The real performance was about to begin. Little did Karen know this was more than just a hedge. This was a declaration of war, suburban style. The municipal inspector arrived precisely at 8 a.m., looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Harold Jenkins was a 35-year veteran of the city's code enforcement division, a man who had seen everything, or so he thought. He adjusted his glasses, checked his clipboard, and approached Mark's property with the weary resignation of a bureaucrat who had long since lost any passion for his job. Karen Reynolds stood nearby, practically vibrating with anticipation. She'd spent the entire night preparing a meticulously documented file, complete with color-coded tabs, aerial photographs, and a 12-page report detailing every perceived violation of neighborhood landscaping guidelines. "This is going to be spectacular," she muttered to herself, her tablet at the ready to document every moment of Mark's impending humiliation. The hedge was now unmistakably taking shape. What had once been a simple property boundary was now a massive, intricately carved topiary that defied every conventional landscaping rule. Mark stood to the side, seemingly nonchalant, sipping coffee and watching the inspectors approach. Harold Jenkins stopped dead in his tracks about 20 feet from the hedge. He blinked, then blinked again. "Is that?" he started, then stopped. Karen rushed forward, her excitement barely contained. "I told you. Completely unacceptable. A total violation off." Her words died in her throat as the full detail of Mark's creation became apparent. The hedge was no longer just a hedge. It was a massive, unmistakable sculptural representation of an enormous middle finger, perfectly proportioned and visible from nearly every angle of the neighborhood. The level of detail was extraordinary, each line, each curve meticulously carved to create a three-dimensional masterpiece of botanical rebellion. Harold Jenkins did something completely unexpected. He started to laugh. Not a chuckle, not a giggle, a full-throated belly laugh that echoed down the street. Tears began to stream down his face as he doubled over, his official clipboard falling to the ground. Karen stood frozen, her carefully prepared documentation suddenly seeming ridiculous in the face of Mark's audacious creation. "You can't, this isn't," she sputtered, her face turning a shade of red that seemed medically impossible. Mark simply raised an eyebrow and took another sip of his coffee. The municipal inspector finally composed himself, wiping tears from his eyes. He picked up his clipboard, looked at Karen, then looked at Mark, then back at the Hedge. "Well," Harold said, clearing his throat and trying to maintain some semblance of professional composure, "let's review the regulations." Sarah, watching from her front porch, was recording everything on her phone. This was going to be epic. The neighborhood held its collective breath. The official inspection of the most controversial hedge in suburban history is about to begin. Mark allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. This was going exactly according to plan. The video went viral faster than anyone could have anticipated. Within hours, Mark's hedge had become an internet sensation, a symbol of suburban rebellion that captured the imagination of millions. Local news vans arrived, national media outlets began calling, and social media exploded with memes, support, and commentary. Harold Jenkins' unexpected reaction had been the catalyst. His body camera had captured the entire interaction, including his uncontrollable laughter and the subsequent inspection. The footage showed something remarkable: a city official who recognized the absurdity of petty neighborhood regulations and refused to be baited into unnecessary conflict. Karen Reynolds, however, was not going down without a fight. She filed a formal complaint with the city, calling an emergency meeting of the neighborhood association. The community center was packed that evening, with more people attending than any meeting in the neighborhood's history. Mark sat calmly in the back row, Sarah beside him, both trying to suppress their amusement. "This is about more than just a hedge," Karen proclaimed, her voice trembling with indignation. "This is about respecting community standards, about maintaining property values, about decency." The room was split. Some neighbors nodded in agreement, while others, many of whom had been secretly oppressed by Karen's endless list of rules, began to murmur in support of Mark. Mrs. Goldstein, the retired art teacher, was the first to speak up. "It's actually quite a remarkable piece of topiary," she said, adjusting her glasses. "The precision, the proportions, the absolute audacity. It's art, pure and simple." A local landscape architect who had been quietly listening stood up. "Technically," he said, "the hedge meets all municipal height requirements. The shape is immaterial. There are no specific regulations about topiary design." Mark's lawyer, a family friend he'd consulted before beginning his botanical masterpiece, sat quietly, a slight smile playing on his lips. They both knew something Karen didn't. Every single action had been meticulously planned. The meeting evolved into chaos. People were shouting, taking sides. Some were defending Mark's right to express himself. Others, mostly those who shared Karen's vision of suburban perfection, demanded immediate action. But the tide was turning. Local media had picked up the story. Interviews with Mark revealed a man who was articulate, reasonable, and wickedly funny. He spoke about individual expression, about the suffocating nature of overly restrictive community guidelines. People were listening. The hedge had become more than just a middle finger to Karen. It was a statement about suburban freedom, about pushing back against mindless conformity. As the meeting reached its peak of tension, a surprising development was about to unfold. The city's response was coming, and no one could have predicted what was about to happen. Mark leaned back in his chair, calm and collected. This was far from over.